In a quiet diner off Highway 12, Isabella Cruz, a scarred former combat medic, serves coffee with steady grace, her past hidden beneath an apron. Her scars, earned saving Marines in a fiery ambush, draw stares and whispers. One morning, a businessman's cruel taunt shatters the diner's calm, mocking her appearance. Unfazed, Isabella responds with quiet dignity, hinting at her heroic past. As the incident spreads online, veterans rally, and her story of sacrifice surfaces. The diner becomes a stage for honor, as Marines she saved begin to gather, their gratitude poised to rewrite her legacy. If Isabella's story of quiet courage moved you, join us in celebrating unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell to never miss an inspiring tale. Share stories of resilience in the comments. Support our channel to keep these powerful narratives alive. Together, let's honor those who carry on. The waitress of May's diner. The businessman's voice cut through the diner's hum like a shard of glass, his words dripping with contempt. "You really think someone like you belongs out here?" he sneered, his cold eyes fixed on Isabella Cruz, tracing the jagged scars that etched her face and arm. His lips twisted, as if her existence in this small, dusty diner was an affront to his carefully curated world. He leaned back in his booth, his expensive suit out of place among the chipped formica and faded vinyl, his gaze lingering on the raised, uneven lines that began at her temple and vanished beneath her collar. To him, she was a curiosity, a blemish in the polished narrative of his day. Isabella stood unflinching, her posture steady, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle him. She felt the weight of his judgment, only a flicker of pity for the man who thought he could wound her with words. Her lips curved softly, a smile that held depths of resilience he couldn't imagine. "I've served men like you before," she said, her voice low and even, threaded with a strength forged in places far darker than this, but in places far worse than this. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a past she didn't need to explain. She watched as his sneer wavered, his confidence shaken by something he couldn't name, before he turned away, dismissing her with a careless wave of his coffee with a grunt. The diner fell into a tense silence, the clatter of silverware and hum of chatter fading. A trucker at the counter tightened his grip on his knuckles, whitening as he wrestled with the urge to confront the stranger. A young couple in a booth by the window paused mid-conversation, their eyes darting between Isabella and the man, their curiosity tinged with unease. Isabella felt their stares but let them slide off her like water. She turned back to her movements, fluid and deliberate, wiping the counter with slow, rhythmic strokes, her mind already drifting back to the quiet rhythm of her work. The next morning, though, the world outside May's diner transformed. As dawn broke over the mist-shrouded street just off Highway 12, figures began to materialize in the fog, standing in silent vigil. Each held a small cloth-wrapped token, their faces etched with purpose. These were no strangers. They were Marines, bound by battles fought and scars earned alongside Isabella Cruz. One by one, they stepped through the diner's glass door, not for breakfast, but to honor a woman the world had tried to forget, a woman they refused to let fade into obscurity. Isabella had started her day as she always did, arriving at 5 a.m., her footsteps soft against the gravel. The neon "open" sign flickered to life, bathing the window in a warm red glow that pushed back the darkness. Inside, the air held the faint, comforting scent of yesterday's coffee and bleach, a quiet sanctuary before the day began. She tied her faded blue apron, its fabric, soft fabric worn smooth by years of service, and began her ritual of waking the diner. The griddle warmed under her touch, coffee brewed with a soft gurgle, bacon sizzled with a comforting pop. She wiped the booze with care, each motion a quiet act of devotion to this place that had become her haven. Her scars, though, were always the first thing people saw. They began just below her right temple, raised and uneven, trailing down her neck and disappearing beneath her collar, only to reappear on her forearm when she wore short sleeves. These weren't faint, forgettable marks. They were deep, discolored, a map of survival etched into her skin. New customers often froze, their eyes betraying shock or pity before they remembered to look away. Some stared too long, their curiosity overriding their manners. While children pointed with innocent bluntness, only to be shushed by embarrassed parents. The regulars, though, saw past the surface. To them, Isabella was the diner's heartbeat, as constant as the creaky booth number 4 or the chipped salt shakers on every table. No one knew much about her life beyond her work. She never spoke of her past, her evenings, or where she went when she left. She arrived before dawn, left after lunch, and walked alone, her stride steady and solitary. To most, she was simply the scarred waitress with the quiet smile, a woman whose hands never trembled and whose history remained a closed book. But Isabella's story went far beyond the apron. Years ago, she had worn a different uniform of the Marine Corps combat medic, serving with Echo 2 Division. Her work was frontline triage, stitching wounds and saving lives amid chaos. Sandstorms, mortar fire, and crumbling shelters where supplies dwindled. She had once treated a convoy ambushed in Fallujah for 3 sleepless days, her focus unyielding as bullets flew. Her scars came on her second tour, when a supply truck exploded outside Forward Operating Base Courage. 2 Marines were trapped in the burning wreckage, their screams lost in the fire's roar. Isabella ran toward the flames, her hands searing as she freed them, her training drowning out fear. She saved them both, but the explosion left her with wounds that marked her forever as a hero, a word she'd never claim. Now, as the Marines entered the diner, their tokens in hand, small folded cloths carrying memories of shared sacrifice, Isabella felt her heart falter, a crack in her carefully guarded composure. Their eyes met hers, seeing not her scars, but the woman who had fought beside them, who had carried their pain as her own. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, her past and present colliding in a quiet, powerful tribute that reminded her she was still that Marine, still unbroken. The inferno roared, swallowing the mangled Humvee in a merciless grip of flame and smoke. Isabella Cruz stood at the edge of the chaos, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Fear clawed at her insides, but duty, unyielding, fierce, pushed it down. She had no helmet, no backup, nothing but a roll of gauze tucked in her pocket, the sting of adrenaline in her veins, and an unshakable sense of responsibility. The 2 Marines trapped inside were screaming, their voices barely cutting through the crackle of fire. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight into the blaze. Her boots crunched against the scorched earth as she yanked open the vehicle's door, the heat searing her skin even through her gloves. The first Marine was slumped against the seat, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his eyes wide with terror. Isabella grabbed him under the arms, her muscles straining as she dragged him free, her breath ragged in the suffocating air. She stumbled back, laying him on the ground before turning to the second man, still pinned inside, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Her hands shook as she worked to free him, the fire licking closer, singeing her hair. She got him out, half carrying, half dragging him to safety. No sooner had she collapsed beside them than a secondary explosion tore through the wreckage. The blast threw her forward, shrapnel slicing into her side like 1,000 jagged knives. Pain erupted, white-hot and blinding, but she threw herself over one of the Marines, shielding him as her right arm took the brunt of the fire's wrath. The world became a blur of heat, blood, and distant shouts, someone calling her name maybe, or just the echo of her own pulse. Then darkness swallowed her whole. She woke 2 days later in a field hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. Her body felt like it had been shattered and stitched back together, every breath a reminder of the wounds that now defined her. A nurse, her voice soft but heavy with awe, leaned close and whispered, "You're lucky to be alive." Isabella didn't feel lucky. She felt hollow, haunted by the memory of fire and the weight of what she'd done. Her medical records would later detail severe trauma sustained in active combat while rescuing personnel under fire. Her commanding officer, his face etched with pride and sorrow, recommended her for a commendation. In time, she received a Purple Heart, a medal that felt both like an honor and a burden. Then, she vanished from the military world, slipping into the shadows of civilian life. But civilian life was no sanctuary. Job interviews became a parade of polite rejections, each one a fresh wound. Employers' eyes would linger on the scars that snaked across her neck and arm, their smiles tightening as they murmured, "We'll be in touch." She wasn't a good fit for customer-facing roles, they said, their words dripping with pity or discomfort. The rejections piled up, each one chipping away at her resolve until she stopped trying altogether. She withdrew, her world shrinking to the bare essentials, a small apartment, a few bills, and the ghosts of her past. Then came May's Diner. Margaret Benson, the owner, was a no-nonsense woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that saw more than most. When Isabella walked in, scars and all, Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't ask questions. She just looked Isabella over and said, "Can you be here by 5 a.m.?" Isabella nodded, her throat tight with gratitude she couldn't voice. From that day forward, the diner became her haven, her battlefield of peace. She poured coffee, cleared plates, and moved through the days with quiet efficiency, her past buried deep beneath her calm exterior. To the regulars at May's, she was just Izzy, the soft-spoken waitress who remembered your order and never missed a shift. They didn't know she'd once run through a hail of mortar shells to save lives. They didn't suspect that the woman who refilled their mugs with steady hands had once pressed her fingers against a dying man's artery, willing him to hold on until help arrived. Isabella carried her history in silence, woven into the scars she hid beneath long sleeves and the memories she locked away. But one morning that past would come striding through the diner's front door, not with fanfare or words, but with a quiet, unspoken reverence. Tuesday mornings at May's Diner were usually uneventful, a gentle rhythm of familiar faces and small talk. Truckers nursed their black coffee, construction workers swapped stories about the day's work, and the retired school principal hunched over his crossword puzzle, muttering to himself. They greeted Isabella with saws or faint smiles, their conversations drifting to the weather, football scores, or nothing at all. She moved among them like a ghost, her presence steady but unobtrusive, her thoughts tucked away behind a polite mask. But this Tuesday was different. At 8:37 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and 3 men stepped inside, their pressed shirts and loosened ties marking them as outsiders. They were likely headed to a business meeting in the city, passing through this small town without a second thought. Their cologne hung heavy in the air, a sharp contrast to the diner's comforting scent of coffee and bacon. Their laughter was loud, grating, as if they owned the space, oblivious to the quiet rhythm they disrupted. They slid into the corner booth by the window, their voices carrying over the clink of silverware. Isabella approached with her usual grace, menus tucked under one arm, coffee pot balanced in her hand. She greeted them with a nod, setting down the menus and leaning forward to pour their coffee. The largest of the 3, a man with a broad chest and a smug grin, stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locked onto the scars that traced her neck, visible just above her collar, and followed them as they disappeared beneath her uniform. His gaze wasn't curious, it was cruel, judgmental. He didn't bother to lower his voice. "You really think someone like you should be out here serving people?" He sneered, his smirk twisting like a blade. "Wouldn't dishwashing in the back be more appropriate?" The words landed like a grenade, shattering the diner's fragile peace. Forks stilled. Coffee cups hung suspended in midair. The elderly couple at booth 6 averted their eyes, their discomfort palpable. The cook, halfway through flipping a pancake, froze, his spatula hovering above the griddle. The air grew thick, every patron holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Isabella straightened, her face a mask of calm. Inside, a storm churned, anger, humiliation, and the weight of every rejection she'd ever faced. But she'd faced worse than this man's words. She'd faced fire, blood, and death. His cruelty was nothing compared to that. She met his gaze, her eyes steady and unflinching, and said, "I've served men like you before." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. The man's smirk faltered, but Isabella didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to the counter, her step measured, her heart pounding. In a small, fluorescent-lit diner off a dusty highway, the air was thick with the scent of fried eggs and brewing coffee. A businessman in a crisp suit, his tie slightly loosened, sat at a corner booth with 2 colleagues. His voice carried a smug edge as he leaned forward, smirking at the waitress who had just refilled their cups. "I've been to wolf spots before," he boasted, "but none as bad as this place." His words hung in the air, sharp and careless, aimed at Isabella Cruz, the woman behind the counter, whose scarred face told stories he couldn't begin to fathom. Isabella paused, her hand steady on the coffee pot, though a faint tremor betrayed the sting of his words. Her dark eyes flicked up, meeting his with a quiet intensity that caught him off guard. "I've been in worse places," she said, her voice low but firm, slicing through the din of clinking forks and murmured conversations. The businessman blinked, clearly unprepared for her response. His companion shifted uncomfortably, letting out forced chuckles to smooth over the awkwardness. But the moment felt fractured, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. He leaned back, his scoff dripping with condescension. "What, you? In the military?" His gaze raked over her scars, each mark a testament to battles he'd never understand. "With a face like that, you wouldn't even make it to the recruitment office parking lot." His laughter erupted, harsh and solitary, echoing in the suddenly silent diner. No one joined him, not the waitress at the register, her hands frozen on the cash drawer, not the old man in the back booth, his fork hovering over his plate, not the truck driver at the counter who stood abruptly, his half-eaten eggs abandoned. He slapped a $10 bill on the table, his jaw tight, and walked out, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. Isabella didn't flinch. She moved on, her steps deliberate as she poured coffee for a regular, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside. Her face remained a mask of calm, but her eyes, sharp, calculating, scanned the room like a soldier assessing a battlefield. Every glance, every tightened jaw, every averted gaze was noted, filed away like a field report. She felt the weight of their stares, the pity, the curiosity, the quiet respect. It was a weight she'd carried for years, one she'd learned to bear with a grace that felt like defiance. Near the service station, Margaret Benson, the diner's matronly cook, watched with a mother's worry etched into the deep lines of her face. Her apron was stained with grease, her hands rough from years of flipping burgers, but her voice was soft as she stepped beside Isabella. "You okay, Izzy?" she asked, her eyes searching for cracks in the younger woman's armor. The concern was raw, unfiltered, a lifeline offered in the quiet chaos of the diner. "I'm fine," Isabella replied, her tone clipped but not unkind. She folded napkins with mechanical precision, each crease a small act of control. "I've handled worse in Fallujah." The name dropped like a stone, heavy with memory. Margaret's jaw tightened, her hand finding Isabella's shoulder in a gentle, grounding touch. "You don't have to serve them," she said, her voice firm. "I can take their order." Isabella shook her head, her lips curving into a faint, resolute smile. "No need," she said. "Some people are scared of what they don't know. It's not my job to fix them." With that, she picked up the coffee pot again, her movements fluid, purposeful, as she returned to the tables. The act was mundane, but to her, it was a reclaiming of space, a refusal to be diminished. At the next booth, an older man in a faded Marine Corps cap watched her approach. His hands, weathered and scarred, rested on the table, and his eyes held a quiet understanding. He said nothing, but as he stood to leave, he placed a $20 bill on a $5 tab. Their gazes met as he passed, a fleeting connection that spoke volumes, a shared language forged in sacrifice, a nod of respect that needed no words. Isabella's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and pride swelling within her, but she kept moving, her focus unwavering. Back at the corner booth, the businessmen had fallen silent. Whether it was shame or discomfort, no one could say. They ate quickly, their forks scraping against plates in a hurried rhythm. They paid in cartwheels, avoiding Isabella's gaze, and slipped out without another word. The diner exhaled, the tension easing like a held breath finally released. But the moment lingered, its ripples spreading beyond the checkered floors and vinyl booths. Later that day, someone, a regular perhaps, or a stranger moved by what they'd witnessed, posted about the incident online. It was a brief account, no names or photos, just the story of a scarred waitress who faced cruelty with unshakable dignity, and a diner full of people who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. The post spread slowly at first, shared once, then 10 times, then 100. By nightfall, it had reached veterans groups across the country, a quiet tribute to a woman who carried her scars like medals. Isabella, though, was unaware of the digital wildfire. She closed the diner as she always did, sweeping the floor with steady strokes, wiping down the counter until it gleamed, and flipping off the neon open sign. Outside, the streetlights buzzed to life, casting a soft glow on the empty parking lot. Inside, one woman stood alone, scarred but unbroken. Her dignity, a quiet force that outshone the world's cruelty. Before she was Isabella Cruz, the unassuming waitress at May's Diner, she was Corporal Cruz, a combat medic with Echo 12, a Marine logistics unit stationed near Fallujah during the war's brutal peak. She hadn't joined the Marines to chase glory. At 23, she was driven by a restless mix of grief and resolve, her heart still raw from her brother's death in Afghanistan. His loss had left a void she couldn't fill, a fire she couldn't douse. The recruiter had been blunt. Medics don't go looking for trouble. You won't be on the front lines. But in Iraq, trouble didn't care about job descriptions. It found her in the form of IEDs, ambushes, and blood-soaked transport trucks. Her mission was simple but harrowing. Keep her unit alive long enough to get them home. She worked in chaos, stabilizing blast wounds in bomb craters, using belts as tourniquets when supplies ran low, her hands steady even as her pulse raced. Every life she saved was a small victory. Every life she lost was a wound that never healed. Isabella carried those wounds still, not just on her skin, but in the quiet moments when the diner was empty and the memories crept in. She didn't talk about Fallujah, not to Margaret, not to the regulars, not even to herself. But the diner had become her new battlefield, one where she fought not with bandages, but with kindness, not with tourniquets, but with resilience. The businessman's words had cut deep, but they hadn't broken her. She'd faced worse, far worse, and emerged stronger each time. As she locked the diner's door that night, the stars above glittered in the vast, indifferent sky. Tomorrow the world would come back. Truckers, locals, strangers passing through. But this time something would be different. The story of the scarred waitress was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who'd read it, everyone who'd shared it. And though Isabella didn't know it yet, the world was beginning to remember her, not for her scars, but for the grace that made them beautiful. In the blistering chaos of war, where medical supplies dwindled to nothing, Isabella crafted tourniquets from whatever scraps she could find. Torn fabric, belts, anything that could stem the bleeding. Her reputation as a corpsman was forged in those desperate moments, her composure unshakable, her hands steady as iron amidst the pandemonium of combat. Her mind, sharp and focused, cataloged every detail. The weight of her medical pack, the sting of sweat in her eyes, the cacophony of gunfire. Yet nothing in her years of service had prepared her for the crucible of March 2010. Echo 12, her unit, was tasked with shuttling supplies between outposts, a routine mission under a sky heavy with the threat of violence. Their convoy rumbled through the dusty trails near Forward Operating Base Courage, a lonely outpost ringed by low, crumbling walls that offered little more than the illusion of safety. Isabella was in the back of an armored transport, her clipboard in hand, meticulously checking inventory, bandages, saline, morphine, when the world erupted. The first mortar blast shook the ground, a deafening roar that sent her heart racing. She dropped to the floor, her training kicking in, counting the seconds between explosions, each one a pulse of dread. Screams pierced the air, mingling with the acrid smell of smoke and the crackle of static on the radio. Somewhere close, a vehicle had been hit, its frame groaning under the impact. Instinct took over. Isabella didn't hesitate, didn't stop to strap on her body armor or wait for orders. Her pack slung over her shoulder, she sprinted toward the plume of black smoke rising from the wreckage. Her boots pounded the earth, her breath sharp in her chest, but her mind was clear, singularly focused on the lives at stake. The burning transport loomed ahead, its metal skeleton glowing with heat, flames licking at the front cabin. 2 Marines were trapped inside. One lay unconscious, his body slumped against the warped interior. The other was pinned beneath a twisted seat frame, his screams raw with pain and terror, his eyes wide with the realization of his own mortality. Isabella didn't think about the danger, didn't register the shouts of her comrades urging her to stop. She climbed through the shattered side panel, the jagged edges tearing at her uniform. The heat was suffocating, searing her skin, melting the soles of her boots as she moved. Her hands, steady despite the chaos, gripped the unconscious Marine's flak jacket. She dragged him out, his weight heavy against her, the gravel biting into her knees as she pulled him to safety. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she turned back without pause. The second Marine was still trapped, his cries weaker now, his strength fading. She wedged herself under the crumpled frame, her shoulders straining as she lifted it just enough to free him. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the fierce determination to bring him out alive. She had just pulled him clear when the second explosion hit. A deafening blast tore through the vehicle's side, a wall of force that flung Isabella into a concrete barrier. Pain exploded in her right arm as it took the brunt of the impact, followed by a sickening crunch as she hit the ground and rolled. The air was ripped from her lungs, her vision swimming in a haze of gray. Her face burned, her ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and the world seemed to tilt and fade. Fragments of memory flickered through her mind. The sticky warmth of blood soaking her uniform, the stench of diesel and charred flesh, a distant voice shouting her name, and the rhythmic thump of a medevac helicopter slicing through the sky. When she woke 2 days later in a field hospital, the world was a blur of antiseptic and soft beeps. Her right arm was swathed in bandages, her face wrapped in gauze that pulled tight with every movement. A nurse stood over her, her voice gentle but distant, whispering, "You made it." Isabella's throat tightened, not from relief but from the weight of what had happened. For weeks, she avoided mirrors, unable to face the raw, patchwork skin grafts or the burns that throbbed with every heartbeat. The doctors called her lucky, her arm still functioned, a miracle given the damage. But the physical pain was a shadow compared to the ache in her chest. She couldn't go back. The life she'd known, the purpose that had defined her, was gone. Her commanding officer visited before her discharge, his face etched with respect and something softer, almost paternal. "You saved 2 lives that day," he said, pressing a citation for extraordinary valor into her hand. The paper felt foreign, its words hollow to her. "You're not just a corpsman," he added, his voice firm. "You're the reason they're going home." Isabella nodded, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the floor. Praise felt like a weight she didn't know how to carry. She was used to action, to doing her job, not to being lauded for it. When she returned to the States, there was no fanfare, no parade, just the quiet hum of bureaucracy. She signed paperwork, collected a box of her belongings, her uniform, her scorched boots, and a purple heart she couldn't bring herself to look at. She didn't feel she deserved it. She'd only done what needed doing. She settled in a small North Carolina town, far from the clamor of military bases or the sterile halls of veterans' hospitals. Her apartment was modest, a 1-bedroom with plain walls and a view of a quiet street. She took a job at a diner, pouring coffee and serving plates of eggs to locals who never asked about her past. She preferred it that way, blending into the rhythm of small-town life, hoping routine would dull the edges of her memories. But the war followed her. It lived in the tremor of her hand in the pre-dawn hours, when the world was too still. It woke her during thunderstorms, her heart racing as thunder mimicked the mortar she'd left behind. Her scars, visible but unexplained, were a map of that day, jagged lines across her arm, a faint burn across her cheek. She didn't hide them, but she didn't invite questions either. To the townsfolk, she was a quiet woman with a steady hand and a guarded smile. To the Marines of Echo 12, she was a hero, the reason they drew breath, though she never sought their gratitude. Years later, those she saved would find her, their voices thick with emotion she'd never expected, their words a reminder of the lives she'd forever changed. The morning air bit at the skin, sharper than usual for a Tuesday in early fall. A delicate mist draped the silent streets, softening the edges of the town, which still slumbered under a gray dawn. Inside May's diner, Isabella Cruz moved with the quiet precision of someone who had long mastered her routine. Her hands, steady and sure, flipped the open sign at precisely 6:00 a.m., the click of the lock echoing in the empty space. She expected the usual, coffee brewed strong, eggs sizzling on the grill, and the soft hum of small talk from early risers. But beyond the diner's glass windows, the world had shifted in ways she couldn't yet fathom. Across the street, a line of figures stood shoulder to shoulder, their silhouettes stretching around the corner like a silent promise. Some wore faded jeans and weathered jackets. Others donned simple black coats, but their posture betrayed them. Hands clasped behind backs, spines rigid with discipline, they carried themselves with a quiet authority that marked them as more than civilians. They were Marines. Each held a small, cloth-wrapped object, their faces set with purpose. Isabella, wiping down the counter, caught sight of them through the window, her brow furrowed, confusion flickering in her chest. She didn't understand, not yet. The bell above the door jingled, and the first man stepped inside. He was tall, his temples streaked with gray, his eyes carrying the weight of too many deserts, too many battles. He eased onto a stool at the counter, his movements deliberate, and offered a nod. "Coffee, black," he said, his voice low but steady, like a river carving through stone. Then softer, he added, "You don't remember me, do you?" Isabella paused, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. Something in his tone hugged at a thread buried deep in her memory, a faint echo of a life she'd left behind. She tilted her head, studying his face, searching for a connection. He smiled, just a ghost of a curve at his lips. "Major Carter Brooks, Echo 12. You dragged me out of that fire." Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, like a blade slipping between ribs. Echo 12. The name hadn't crossed her mind in years, yet it flooded her now, flames licking the sky, the acrid burn of smoke in her lungs, the weight of a man slung over her shoulder as she stumbled through chaos. She stared at him, her heart hammering, her mind racing to reconcile the past with the present. Major Brooks reached into his coat and placed a small, green-wrapped bundle on the counter. "I'm not here for breakfast," he said, his voice thick with something unspoken. "I'm here to return something." Isabella's fingers trembled as she unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a battered medallion, its edges dulled by sand and time, the insignia of Echo 12 barely legible. She traced the metal, her throat tightening. "We've been looking for you," Brooks said, his gaze steady but soft. "A private recognized you last week. Said his captain still carried your photo, the one from the field hospital. You were bandaging wounds, your own arm burned raw, but you didn't stop. Not for a second." Her vision blurred, tears welling unbidden. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to bridge the gap between who she'd been and who she was now. She nodded, a small, silent acknowledgement, her chest aching with the weight of memory. Outside, the line of Marines remained, patient and unmoving, each waiting their turn. One by one they entered, each bringing a piece of the past she'd tried to bury. A unit patch, its threads frayed but vibrant. A letter folded with care. A challenge coin, heavy with meaning. A faded photo creased from years of being carried. Some embraced her, their arms tight with gratitude and grief. Others could only nod, their eyes glistening, their throats too choked to speak. A young man came next, his gait uneven, a prosthetic leg visible beneath his jeans. He leaned against the counter, his face boyish but etched with lines no one his age should carry. "You probably don't remember me," he said with a voice rough but warm. He placed a coin in her hand, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "And I remember you. You held pressure on my leg while I screamed and cursed and cried like a kid. And you told me a joke about a camel and a sandwich." He chuckled, the sound raw and real. He laughed, shaking his head. "I laughed. It kept me alive. Gave me something to hold on to when I thought I was done." Isabella's heart twisted, her mind flashing to that moment, his blood slick on her hands, her voice steady despite the chaos, coaxing a laugh from him to keep him tethered to life. She clutched the coin, her knuckles whitening, and managed a shaky smile. "I remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and stepped back to make way for the next. An older Marine approached, his hair thinning, his hands weathered by time. He handed her a folded letter with his fingers lingering, as if reluctant to let it go. "My son was one of the ones you'd be here without her pulled from that trucker," he said, his voice steady, but a father's quiet pride. He smiled. "I smiled, I'd come. He'd gotten 3 kids now, beautiful kids." He smiled. "They wouldn't say I'd be here if it weren't for her, you." You paused, swallowing, and needed you to know. I nodded the letter, hands trembling, and took the letter with trembling hands. She was feeling the weight of his words. A reminder that her actions had shaped lives in ways she could barely comprehend, a gratitude that mingled with sorrow she couldn't untangle. By 10:15 a.m., the local news had caught wind of the gathering. Reporters hovered outside, cameras flashing, but Isabella didn't notice. By noon, the story had rippled across stories by networks nationwide, carried by phone calls, texts, and social media. A trucker who'd stopped for coffee that morning had filmed the line of Marines, posting the video with a caption that burned through her heart. She was mocked yesterday. Today the Marines came for her. The words stung, a reminder of the cruel whispers she'd overheard the day before, the snide comments about her quiet life, her ordinary job. But today, those voices were drowned out by the steady stream of gratitude. More veterans arrived, some driving hours across the state, their faces weary but determined. Families of fallen soldiers came too, clutching photos of sons and daughters who'd served beside her. A woman with silver hair pressed a framed picture into Isabella's hands, her voice trembling. "My daughter talked about you in her letters," she said you were the bravest person she'd ever met. She didn't make it home, but I needed you to know she loved you." Isabella's tears fell freely now, no longer held back, as she traced the young woman's face in the photo, her heart breaking and healing all at once. Isabella didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't pause for a break from the counter. She stood at the counter was a monument, each visitor a thread in a ceremony of memory that she'd woven, a ceremony of honor she felt unworthy but couldn't refuse. A small girl of 9, no older than 9 years old, approached with eyes wide with wonder, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder. "She wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice soft with pride. "She hears stories about you at bedtime." He said. Her smiled, "You're her a hero." The girl smiled, shy but resolute, held out a crayon drawing, a woman with a flowing cape, carrying someone from flames rendered in bold red and orange. Isabella knelt, her heart swelling, and took the drawing with trembling hands. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with tears of emotion. The girl beamed, and Isabella felt something shift, a spark of who she'd been, reignited by the child's unwavering faith. The day stretched on, each moment heavy with meaning, each gesture a reminder of the fire she'd walked through and the lives she'd touched. Isabella stood at the counter, surrounded by patches, coins, letters, and photos, her heart full to bursting. She wasn't just a woman pouring coffee in a small-town diner. She was the one who'd faced the flames when others turned away. And today, they'd come to remind her. In the dim light of May's diner, Isabella Cruz stood behind the counter, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she polished a glass. The weight of the day pressed against her chest, not with the crushing force of despair, but with a quieter, more insidious ache. It was the kind of pain that didn't announce itself with fanfare, but crept in, soft as a whisper, until it filled every corner of her heart. Her eyes, shadowed with memories of fire and sacrifice, glistened with unshed tears. She wasn't breaking in the way people might expect. No loud sobs, no dramatic collapse. Instead, her breath hitched, a delicate shudder, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek, unnoticed by the bustling diner patrons. Each tear carried the weight of what she'd endured, the scars etched not just on her skin, but deep within her soul, scars from battles fought, lives saved, and the heavy burden of being seen only for her wounds. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner's worn linoleum floor, the donation jar on the counter told a different story. Labeled Veteran Support Services, it brimmed with crumpled bills and heartfelt notes, a testament to the community's unspoken gratitude. No one spoke of the 3 men who had mocked Isabella earlier that day, their cruel words slicing through the air like a blade. There was no need to. This wasn't about settling scores or proving a point. It was about honoring those who carried invisible burdens, about remembering the cost of courage. For the first time in years, Isabella felt a warmth in her chest, a flicker of belonging. She wasn't just the woman with the scars anymore, the one whose story was reduced to whispers and pitying glances. She was seen, truly seen, for the strength she'd shown, for the lives she'd pulled from the flames, for the quiet resilience that had carried her through. 2 days later, the bell above the diner's door chimed, its sound softer this time, almost hesitant, as if it knew the weight of what was coming. The three businessmen stepped inside, their polished shoes scuffing against the floor. Gone was the swagger they'd worn like a second skin, the arrogance that had once dripped from their words like venom. Now they moved with a stiffness, their shoulders hunched under the weight of their shame. The leader, the one who had sneered at Isabella's scars with a smirk that cut deeper than any knife, clutched his hat in both hands, twisting it as if it could anchor him against the storm of his own regret. His eyes darted nervously, unable to settle, as if searching for a place to hide from the weight of his actions. The diner fell silent, but it wasn't the tense, fearful hush of before. This was a stillness born of anticipation, a collective holding of breath. Every regular, from the old-timers nursing their second cups of coffee to the Marines who lingered at the counter, watched with quiet intensity. Even the passers-by who'd heard the news story, a small piece about a veteran's quiet stand that had spread like wildfire, craned their necks to peer through the windows. Isabella stood behind the counter, her movements deliberate as she dried a glass, her face a mask of calm. Inside, her heart thundered, a mix of defiance and curiosity. What did these men want now? Did they think words could erase the sting of their mockery? The leader cleared his throat, his voice faltering, stripped of the bravado that had once defined it. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, each word heavy with the effort it took to speak them. "I judged you without knowing you, without understanding what you've carried, what you've given up." His voice cracked, and he looked down, unable to hold her gaze. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, as if the very air in the diner had paused to listen. Even the coffee machine, usually a constant hum in the background, seemed to hold its breath. Isabella set the glass down with care, the clink against the counter barely audible. She walked slowly to the donation jar, its contents spilling over with the generosity of a community that had chosen the respect over judgment. Without a word, she tapped the jar gently, her eyes steady and kind. The man understood immediately. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick stack of folded bills. He slipped them into the jar, where they joined the countless other offerings, each one a quiet acknowledgement that respect was not just spoken but shown. Isabella met his gaze, her expression unwavering but soft, and gave the faintest nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph or vindication. It was forgiveness, pure and simple, a recognition that he had taken the first step toward change. "I see you've learned," it said. "Now carry that lesson forward." The men left, their heads bowed, their footsteps heavy with the weight of their reckoning. Inside the diner, life stirred back to normal. Coffee poured into mugs, plates clinked as they were stacked, and conversations resumed, though they carried a new warmth, a softness that hadn't been there before. Margaret Benson, the diner's owner, watched from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed and a satisfied smile tugging at her lips. Later, as they locked up for the night, she turned to Isabella, her voice gentle but firm. "You could have kept that money, you know. Heaven knows you've earned every cent of it." Isabella's smile was no longer the guarded, cautious one she'd worn for so long, the one that shielded her from a world that too often saw only her scars. This was a full, radiant smile, one that seemed to light her up from within, as if a long, dormant spark had finally caught flame. "No," she said softly, her voice steady with conviction. "That money belongs to all of them, to every soul still fighting, still reaching for a better world." In the weeks that followed, the ripples of that day spread far beyond the diner's walls. The high school principal, moved by the story that had swept through the town, commissioned a plaque for the counseling office. It read, "Respect all scars, seen and unseen," a quiet reminder to every student who passed through those halls. At the local VA clinic, a photograph of Isabella behind the counter was hung with pride, a simple inscription beneath it: "Courage isn't always loud." Other businesses followed suit, their windows adorned with signs proclaiming veteran-friendly, scar-friendly, human-friendly. May's Diner became more than just a place for greasy pancakes and bottomless coffee. It became a beacon, a gathering place where people came not just to eat, but to remember, to honor, and to carry forward the quiet strength of a woman who had shown them what it meant to be truly seen. May's Diner stood as a haven, a soft glow of warmth for anyone bearing unseen weight, whether etched into their skin or buried deep within their hearts. On quiet nights when the last of the evening crowd had trickled out, Isabella Cruz would settle by the window, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. Her gaze drifted to the streetlights outside, their amber flicker dancing across the empty sidewalk. In those still moments, her mind wandered to the people who had crossed her path. The young girl who'd shyly handed her a crayon drawing of a sunrise, its colors bold and unapologetic. The Marines who'd gripped her hand with a quiet respect that spoke louder than words. The elderly man, his eyes misty, who'd left his purple heart on the counter with a trembling whisper. "You gave me another chance to live." As she sat there, the weight of those encounters settled over her, and a truth crystallized in her chest. She hadn't merely survived the fire that scarred her all those years ago. She had become a fire herself, a steady, unyielding flame that refused to be snuffed out by cruelty, pain, or the relentless march of time. Her scars weren't a map of her weaknesses. They were a testament to her resilience, a quiet strength that now shone brightly enough for others to see. One crisp afternoon, as autumn leaves skittered across the diner's doorstep, a simple envelope arrived, hand-delivered by a courier who tipped his cap and vanished. Inside was a card, its gold embossing catching the light, inviting Isabella Cruz to a ceremony in her honor, signed by former members of Echo Company, 12th Regiment. Her breath caught as she read it. Doubt crept in, cold and familiar. She hadn't worn a dress in years, hadn't faced a crowd since her medical discharge from the Marines. The thought of standing under scrutiny made her stomach twist, her fingers tracing the raised scars along her jaw. But then Major Carter Brooks called, his voice warm yet resolute, carrying the weight of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Isabella," he said, "this is for you. You deserve this." Something in his tone, a mix of admiration and insistence, stirred her. Against her hesitation, she found herself agreeing, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Okay, I'll be there." The ceremony was held at the town's VFW Hall, a modest brick building nestled 3 blocks from the diner, its walls steeped in the quiet pride of those who'd served. On the night of the event, Isabella stood before her mirror, her heart pounding as she slipped into a simple black dress. It hugged her frame softly, unpretentious yet elegant. For the first time in a decade, she let her dark hair fall loose, cascading over her shoulders, framing the scars that traced her jaw and neck, like delicate veins of a map only she could read. She made no move to cover them, no effort to hide. These marks were part of her story, and tonight she would carry them with quiet dignity. When she stepped into the VFW hall, the air shifted. The room, filled with over 200 people, rose as one. Marines in crisp dress blues, veterans in worn jackets adorned with faded patches, families with children clutching small American flags. Their eyes turned to her, not with pity or curiosity, but with a reverence that made her chest tighten. For a fleeting moment, Isabella froze, her breath shallow, overwhelmed by the sea of faces. The weight of their gaze pressed against her, stirring memories of the fire, the chaos, the choices she'd made when fear had screamed louder than reason. But then Margaret Benson, a fellow veteran who'd become a friend, rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Go on, honey," she whispered, her voice a soft anchor. "This is your family, too." Major Carter Brooks met her halfway down the aisle, his presence steady and grounding. He turned to the crowd, his voice clear and unwavering. "For 7 years we searched for Isabella Cruz," he began, his words carrying the weight of time and loss. "After her medical discharge, she vanished, as so many wounded warriors do. Some of us feared we'd lost her forever." His voice cracked, just for a moment, and he paused, swallowing the emotion that threatened to spill over. But she didn't disappear. She rebuilt herself. She carried on. And in doing so, she's healed others in ways she may never fully comprehend. One by one, those she had saved stepped forward, their stories weaving a tapestry of gratitude and survival. A man, now a Little League coach, spoke of his son's games, how the crack of the bat and the cheers of the crowd were moments he owed to Isabella's courage. A woman, her voice steady but psyche, described how Isabella's calm hands, steady even in the face of chaos, had inspired her to become a nurse, to carry that same strength into her own work. A retired colonel, his hands trembling slightly, held up a photograph of 3 laughing grandchildren. They exist because of you, he said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. Each story landed like a stone in Isabella's heart, stirring emotions she'd long buried. Grief for the pain she'd endured, pride for the leaders she'd touched, and a quiet awe that her actions had rippled so far. Tears slipped down her cheeks, tracing paths along her scars, unhidden and unashamed. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium, her hands resting on its cool surface, grounding her as the room fell silent. The crowd didn't rush her, didn't press. They simply waited, their presence a steady pulse of support. She stood there for a long moment, her throat tight, searching for words to capture the storm of feelings within her. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute, carrying the strength she'd forged through fire. I never thought of myself as special, she said, her fingers brushing lightly against the scars on her neck. I just did what needed to be done when it mattered most. These scars, they're not marks of tragedy. They're proof that when the fire came, I chose to move forward. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was terrified and still acted. The applause that followed wasn't a roaring wave, but a steady, heartfelt swell, like a collective heartbeat. It filled the hall, wrapping around Isabella, a reminder that her light had not only endured, but had illuminated the lives of others, burning bright and unyielding. The auditorium erupted in a thunderous ovation, the kind that reverberates deep within, stirring emotions long buried. It wasn't just clapping, it was a collective outpouring of awe, gratitude, and reverence that seemed to dislodge something heavy in the hearts of everyone present. Major Brooks, his uniform crisp and his eyes glistening with pride, stepped forward to present Isabella Cruz with a shadow box. Inside gleamed her long-lost Purple Heart, a medal she'd earned through blood and sacrifice but had never received until this moment. Alongside it was a unit commendation, approved years ago but never delivered, and a newly crafted plaque inscribed with words that honored her valor in the face of unrelenting fire. Isabella stood tall, her posture steady despite the weight of the moment, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and quiet triumph. This was Echo 12, her call sign, her identity forged in the crucible of war, now being celebrated in a way she'd never imagined. As the applause began to fade, a young Marine approached her, his steps tentative but purposeful. Isabella's breath caught as she studied his face. He was older now, his features hardened by time and experience, no longer the boyish recruit she'd known in the chaos of battle. In his arms, he cradled an infant, swaddled in a soft blanket, the child's tiny fingers clutching at the air. The Marine's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the years melted away, taking her back to the dust and smoke, to the moments when they'd relied on each other to survive. His voice was soft, almost shy, and as he spoke, "We named him Thomas Isabella," he said, his words trembling with emotion. "So he'll always carry a piece of you. So he'll grow up knowing what courage looks like." Isabella's throat tightened, her chest swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She reached out, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek, and in that fleeting touch, she felt a connection to something eternal, a legacy she hadn't realized she'd built. The Marine's gratitude, his decision to honor her in such a profound way, left her reeling, her mind racing with memories of the lives she'd fought for, the comrades she'd saved, and the cost she'd paid. That night, long after the crowd had dispersed and the auditorium's lights had dimmed to a soft glow, Isabella lingered. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building settling. She walked slowly to the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, drawn to the American flag that hung proudly against the wall. The shadow box rested on a table nearby, its contents, the Purple Heart, the commendation, the plaque, catching the muted light and glinting like stars in a quiet sky. For the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to truly feel the weight of her journey. Pride surged through her, not just for surviving the horrors of war, but for serving with unwavering dedication, for touching lives in ways she'd never fully grasped, for leaving behind a legacy that would endure beyond her own years. Her scars, once a source of shame she'd hidden beneath long sleeves and guarded silences, no longer felt like burdens. They were badges of bravery, etched into her skin as proof of her endurance, her sacrifice, and her unyielding spirit. She was the woman who, when the world was consumed by flames, had run toward them without hesitation, driven by a sense of duty that burned brighter than fear. Standing there, alone with her thoughts, Isabella felt a deep certainty settle into her bones. She had never been forgotten, as she'd once feared in the long, lonely nights after her return. Instead, she had been waiting for this moment, for the world to see her not as a survivor, but as a hero. The realization brought tears to her eyes, but they were tears of release, of acceptance, of a heart finally at peace. She traced her fingers over the edge of the shadow box, her mind replaying the faces of those she'd served alongside, the ones who'd made it home and the ones who hadn't. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of her life, woven together to create something beautiful and enduring. Isabella Cruz's story is a powerful reminder that true courage often comes in the quietest forms. In a society that rushes to judge based on appearances, she stands as a living testament that scars, whether carved into flesh or hidden deep within, are not marks of weakness. They are evidence of survival, of resilience, of sacrifices made for something greater than oneself. In today's fast-paced world, it's all too easy to overlook the quiet heroes who walk among us. The veteran working a modest job at the local hardware store, the neighbor who carries invisible wounds with grace, the stranger whose battles remain unseen. They all have stories that deserve more than a fleeting glance. They deserve to be honored, to be recognized for the strength it takes to carry on. Isabella's journey challenges us to pause and reflect. How often do we form opinions about someone without knowing the trials they've faced? How many lives have been shaped by the quiet, unassuming people we pass by every day? Her story invites us to look deeper, to see the courage that lies beneath the surface, and to celebrate the dignity and strength of every person who bears their scars, visible or not, with quiet resolve. If Isabella's story has stirred something in you, perhaps reminding you of someone in your own life who carries their burdens with grace, take a moment to honor them. Share their name, their story, or simply hold them in your heart. Let's lift up the unsung heroes together, giving them the recognition they so richly deserve.